Hello everybody, we're here at the United Nations today again in New York City. Carlos Tea and Anna Nazloan, and we are going to discuss a very important topic today that has been in talks and discussions at the United Nations for the past several weeks. Hello Carla, it's very nice to see you again and talk about this important topic, NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. Could you please tell us a little bit about background of this important issue and how crucial this is for today's world in 21st century?
I think the audience has already seen the unspeakably horrifying photographs of the victims of the bombing of Hiroshima. And this is evidence of what nuclear weapons can do when they're even in the most primitive and smallest state. Nuclear weapons have been developed to a point now where the world can be obliterated many, many times over. The very great Nobel laureate scientist, Professor George Wald of Harvard University, was asked how much nuclear radiation, is safe for a human being, and his response was 0. So,
And I think we have seen horrific catastrophes like Chernobyl in Soviet Union,
of course,
like Fukushima plant, disaster in Japan. It's like, isn't it a warning enough for us what's going to happen? But of course, probably the biggest warning was the first use of nuclear weapons when it happened at the end of World War II in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Could you please talk a little bit?
well, there are very, very dubious arguments that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki might have sped the end of World War II, and some statistics say saved millions of American lives. This is very false, based upon what we now know. One of the first pieces of evidence from one of the most reliable sources in the United States is that the Japanese had begun to sue for surrender prior to the bombing of Hiroshima. There is also evidence that neither the bombing of Hiroshima nor Nagasaki actually ended the war. It was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria which caused the Japanese to finally capitulate completely.
We still see debates here at in the United States. We still see debates. Was it necessary? Was it an absolutely necessary measure, or it was just a decision made for some other purposes?
I think the latter. One of the great theoretical physicists who joined the Manhattan Project was Joseph Rotblat, who was a German Jew, and who joined the Manhattan Project because he believed that we in the United States, or the anti-Nazi forces, need to develop a nuclear weapon before Nazi Germany did. At a dinner party in, I suppose it was Los Alamos, he found out first that Germany had abandoned all efforts to get a nuclear weapon, and secondly, that General Leslie Groves stated that we were going to continue to complete work on the atom bomb and to use it to intimidate the Soviet Union. Now, prior to the bombing of Hiroshima, every member of the Manhattan Project, almost all of the great theoretical physicists who had worked on the project, sent a petition to President Truman urging him not to bomb Hiroshima. General Leslie Groves, who wanted to experiment with the weapon, intercepted the petition to President Truman, who never saw it, and the bombs were dropped because the Pentagon wanted this to happen. They wanted to test the new weapon, and this is documented in a book by James Carroll, the son of General Carroll, who founded the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he has done extensive work on this. His book is called The House of War, The Disastrous Rise of the Pentagon.
So what you're implying, that was like a completely, purely military decision.
Yes.
So President Truman did not even have a chance to see the warnings that the scientists were submitting to him.
Yes. There was at that point, it was the military which had decided to bomb Hiroshima. Truman might have gone along with it, or had he received the petition, he might not have.
Over 300,000 people perished during these bombings or after the horrific effects of, a nuclear disaster.
Well, these are generations. It continues to today.
And it still continues, to be reflected, just as in Chernobyl and just as anywhere else. Children are born with deformities.
Yeah.
People have horrific diseases, chronic conditions,
cancers which
horrific
emerge decades
things
later.
like that, and also hereditary issues because of that. Do you think this thing, like nuclear weapons in general, can ever be justified? There can ever be a situation in the world that using a nuclear weapon, one country against the other, can be justified in any way?
No. And there need not ever arise a situation where a nuclear weapon would need to be used. The Soviet Union had a doctrine saying that they would never use the nuclear weapon, no first use. And the United States has not had that doctrine. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia now has stated, and I did speak yesterday with the head of the Russian delegation, that Russia would use nuclear weapons only if first attacked by a nuclear weapon and if it were able to respond.
As a retaliation.
As a retaliation and a form of defense, or if with conventional means they were attacked in such a devastating way as to threaten the existence of the Russian state. And under those circumstances, they would use nuclear weapons. Those are the only two circumstances, purely defensively.
Do you think the same goes for America? I mean, which circumstances there should be that the United States would consider it acceptable to use nuclear weapons again?
Well, considering that the United States was the first country to use the nuclear weapon, it's clear that it was not used defensively, it was used offensively. And as far as having a nuclear doctrine similar to the current Russian doctrine, I don't know of any. Now, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is being discussed and very, very hotly contested at the United Nations, is a very interesting schism between two forces, the 9 countries who possess nuclear weapons, and I believe the 160 or 70 other countries that do not possess nuclear weapons. And there are two sides to this argument. We were discussing the other day, and I quote my very brilliant colleague from Associated Press, Edith Lederer, who said at one reception, well, seeing what was done to Libya after Gaddafi renounced the use of nuclear weapons or any effort to obtain the know-how, North Korea would certainly hold on to its nuclear weapons, knowing that this was the only means it had to protect itself. Looking at the world that way, there is legitimate reason for any developing country that is either vulnerable or weak
since we talked about
to
this
seek
issue,
nuclear weapons, because it's the only means of protecting themselves from destabilization and overthrow of their government.
Ukraine comes to mind. As you remember, and as all of us know, Ukraine had the 3rd largest arsenal in the world of nuclear weapons, which it gave up willingly, under the condition that Russia and the United States will preserve its territory and will save Ukraine from all kinds of possible attacks. Do you think we would see a different situation with Ukraine if they kept their nuclear arsenal?
It's a very interesting question. Probably. Somebody like President Yanukovych would have been in a position to defend his democratically elected presidency under those circumstances.
I wasn't speaking about his presidency. I was speaking about Ukraine defending itself from outside influences, so to speak.
Well, the current government in Kiev is considered a proxy government. So, in a way, Ukraine, as an example, I would say is not necessarily. And Ukraine is basically has become a territory with a proxy war, NATO against Russia, and Ukraine did allow its weapons to be taken to Russia. It probably would not have reached the point that it has now, where there is a very virulent civil war in Ukraine if they had nuclear weapons.
Because as we see from examples, like you said, Libya, and you talked about North Korea, and we talk about Ukraine, if the country has it, it's some kind of a check. So if they have it, then it's much more unlikely that any other country would try to make decisions for them.
Yes, this is the whole concept of deterrence, nuclear deterrence. And as I listened to the very heated debate the other day, it was clear that the 9 nuclear powers which possess nuclear weapons spoke of the need for nuclear weapons to provide stability and security. For example, in Europe, I believe Angela Merkel was quoted saying that there hadn't been a major war in Europe since they had nuclear weapon powers. On the other hand, that's a peculiar argument. That's the argument of deterrence and the balance of terror.
But we have 8 countries who have not still ratified NPT. And Russia is not amongst those. Russia was one of the first countries to ratify
the NPT.
The NPT.
Yes.
So, but U.S. is one of the biggest countries that hasn't done so. Do you think this situation is ever going to change in the nearest future? And do you think it's crucial on America's part to join this ratification club?
Well, of course, it's crucial that they join the ratification club. Yeah. Whether it will change for the better in the near future, there are not encouraging signs, and the very, very hotly contested issue in the meetings of the Non-Proliferation Treaty conferences here reveal the huge gap in thinking. Austria gave a really superb speech, the nuclear pledge. I believe that there are 159 member states, non-nuclear possessing states, which want to get a ruling by the International Court of Justice that it is illegal to possess nuclear weapons. I suggested to the delegate with whom I spoke that they should include the word criminal to possess nuclear weapons. She feels that a moral force would have an impact on the U.S., the UK, and other members to the NPT. Whether this is realistic or not, I don't know.
But we see United Nations trying to negotiate with these remaining 8 countries to ratify the NPT. Do you think UN is right on track with this, or we still have a long run to go?
It looks as though there's very little willingness to cooperate. There is now a movement, as I said, by the Vienna Pledge group of 169 non-nuclear weapon states. There is a movement to have the possession of nuclear weapons declared illegal, or, as I would think best, declared criminal.
Amoral.
Criminal.
To say
criminal. Leaving out ethics, just simple law. It's criminal to possess, let alone use them. Whether or not this will have any impact, how long it would take to actually create such a treaty, an arrangement, get a law passed, an international law passed. I was told it could be done in 2 or 3 years. It might take 10 or 20 years. And in the interim, there are countries that could acquire nuclear weapons. One of the weaknesses of the nuclear proliferation treaty is that there is no prohibition against a nuclear weapon country stationing nuclear weapons in other countries. So the United States has nuclear weapons stationed in at least 6 or 7 other countries. I am looking for that.
Speaking of the United States, actually, I wanted to ask this question.
Let me just finish this. The problem with this, which the nuclear non-proliferation treaty does not prohibit, is that the countries in which, and the countries are Belgium, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Turkey. These countries where the United States has stationed nuclear weapons, in the process, learn how to develop them. They acquire the information, the means of delivery, and this is actually creating more nuclear weapons.
It's like the United States is propagating the weapons,
Yes.
in other countries,
Yes.
or influences it very heavily.
Yes, they may retain control, but if, for example, there were to be a revolution in any one of these countries, and you got a government in power which was hostile to any number of the nations that have interests in this, they would be in possession of nuclear weapons.
Then we would not have more peaceful Europe like Angela Merkel said.
As she says, perhaps with some degree of wishful thinking. So the treaty.
This is very concerning. I think this is one of the major issues that needs to be addressed.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you think the committee that is dealing with NPT and its promotion here at the United Nations ever addressed that issue properly?
From what I can tell, the answer is no. There are countries that are concerned. The Russian side today said, how would the West feel if Russia were to place nuclear weapons in many of its friendlier states? I don't think that the West would be too happy about
Yeah, let's say in Canada, Mexico, everywhere else.
or allies of them. Or just place them back where they were removed from. Belarus, Kazakhstan.
Yes.
So the treaty...
That's a good point.
Yeah. And then again, there's nothing in the non-proliferation treaty that prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons in outer space. Now the Chinese and the Russians have put before the First Committee on Disarmament year after year after year a treaty to prohibit the placement of weapons in outer space, including nuclear weapons. And that has been opposed by the United States, and which has a doctrine of full spectrum dominance in the air, the sea, land,
If we take
and
a
outer space.
theoretical what if, for example, what if these countries, lots of countries, violate the regulations, or they start placing weapons all around, safeguarding themselves, or even in an attacking mode? Is there a way to address this?
no prohibition against it. There's nothing permitting it, but there's no prohibition against it. And that's
the major issue that we have to deal with.
That's a very serious weakness to the NPT, the
Because if the
Non-Proliferation
countries
Treaty.
know that they're not going to be punished and they can continue exercising these kinds of actions, then it will just go on and on. The vicious cycle would not break.
Yeah, and this does appear to be a treaty that has many loopholes that can rather easily be evaded. And I think that the justification for retaining nuclear weapons, that they contributed to security and stability, or that conditions of adequate security and stability need to occur before they can abolish their own nuclear weapons, is, again, a very unrealistic and illusory approach to this.
Well, they are very defensive in terms of their own weapons that they already possess, ready to go, but they are so very suspicious of all other countries
yes.
trying to get
Yes.
or possibly, presumably developing nuclear weapons.
It's an elite club
Yes.
which possesses nuclear weapons and can impose their will.
Looks like a very close club, and
Yeah.
they don't want any new members. But they do not give up the old members as well.
No, as we said the other day, if Gaddafi had not agreed to give up all efforts to seek or to obtain nuclear weapons, he and his government might be alive today. And they were, in fact, a far better government than what we see in Libya following the United Nations adoption of Resolution 1973 under Chapter 7, which permits and endorses military action.
So do you think like international promises, as we see, go just so far, and many countries who have watched Gaddafi's demise or other leaders' demise, other country revolutions, so to say, they draw their lessons, their conclusions, and it also influences their attitude towards this NPT situation?
I would think they would be very cynical, and looking at situations on the ground realistically, they would want to obtain nuclear weapons as a means of self-defense. Now, if you talk about the abolition of nuclear weapons, it would have to begin with the United States, because the United States was the first country that had nuclear weapons, and as a means of defense, Russia, well, at the time, the Soviet Union and China had to develop nuclear weapons. They are both socialist countries which do not depend upon a military-industrial complex to gain astronomical profits. It is not in their interest to have a military-industrial complex. They would have preferred to invest their money in education, healthcare, job training, social services.
So what you're saying, it was a necessary measure of self-preservation, of
they
guarding
developed
themselves.
they developed nuclear weapons in response to the fact that Washington had used nuclear weapons, and in a certain sense, one cannot blame them.
I actually wanted to ask a question. Since America is so prone to not to react to interferences from outside, be the international organizations or other countries urging her to do something or join the treaty or get on board with something, do you think American public can play a crucial role here? Because during the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and in the aftermath, it was reported that it was completely covered from American public, the human suffering of what Japanese people had to go through, and the photographs were never published, the documentaries were confiscated, people could not see what really happened. When they saw, they were horrified, and they became completely anti-nuclear, anti-bombing themselves, and it's been very heavily criticized afterwards by public speakers, by intellectuals, American intellectuals, and so on and so forth. Do you think that if American public is mobilized in the right way, morally, politically, it can influence U.S. government to ratify the treaty or take some really serious measures in this aspect?
Well, there have been huge demonstrations by Americans. There was one, I believe it was in 1980, millions of people in New York City, in Washington, throughout the country, wanted a freeze on nuclear weapons. They wanted no more weapons. And these were the whole spectrum, the middle class, the intellectual, so-called intellectual elite. A major demonstration in this country against the buildup of nuclear arsenal.
Do you think these feelings, they still persist in America by public?
Well, the economy is very bad here, and people are so concerned about surviving day to day that they are probably not thinking on a daily basis about the dangers nuclear weapons present. Actually, the danger is getting very serious now.
It seems like people are more distracted
and
by
that's, yes,
daily needs of
Yeah.
what they have to do in their lives instead of global issues.
and
like
that's
this.
very tragic because they
But
may
I
not.
remember, Carla, like you rightfully said, it was very interesting that during Vietnam War, it was the American public that influenced the government heavily and basically influenced the fact that the war stopped and troops were called back because there was resistance from within. America.
That was, again, that was an interesting combination of circumstances. You had a draft, and so the students at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale were aware that they might be called up and obliged to go to Vietnam. You had professors, you had white-collar workers, blue-collar workers. They were all vulnerable to going to war. And that was part of the reason why the mobilization was as great as it was. However, it did grow to the point where at one demonstration in Washington, Yale professor Staunton Lynn, one of the great leaders, said we were on the verge of civil war. Now, subsequent to the Vietnam era, the U.S. started speaking of the crisis of democracy, and methods were then developed to control, to limit public mobilization. And of course, throughout that period, the FBI was infiltrating anti-war organizations and creating dissension, causing internal disputes, and basically paralyzing the movement. It's amazing that the movement did continue, and it did play a part in saving not only Vietnamese lives, but many, 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 many American lives, and there were many people in the Pentagon who were opposed to the war.
That's a very good example. Maybe if the public in all these countries who did not ratify the treaty is mobilized in the right way, and they urge their governments to make the right decisions, these decisions will finally be made.
Unfortunately, Anna,
as one of the measures to influence these people.
Yes, this would help, but unfortunately, movements like this require leaders, and leaders can be very cleverly picked off, either co-opted or assassinated, and that's a very, very big problem, is the coherence of an organization and skilled leaders.
Well, but many people in position of power understand well enough that if we have another global war, it could be the last, and probably would be the last for humankind, for civilization. So this should be on top of their agenda, NPT. One of the most important issues is just survival of civilization. We cannot be, swamped in national issues or little interests of our own when we're talking about humankind. Do you think this will finally have a sobering effect on them, and they will come around?
It's very difficult to know. There was a very classic film called Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And what it pointed out was that there are people who feel they can live underground in bunkers, which are safe from atomic weapons, and they really don't see themselves as being endangered by this.
There were rumors, by the way, that during Cold War, lots of Americans had such bunkers built in their backyards or whatever. Is it true, or it's just a myth?
It may or may not be true. That I couldn't say, but I know that...
So the fear was that big, of each other, or of not knowing, probably.
Probably, yeah. And of not realizing that little bunkers built in your backyard were not going to save your lives.
And I think it was also a lack of dialogue. And we still have that issue. Iron Curtain or no Iron Curtain, we still have that lack of dialogue between nations. And that's why we don't know who we are dealing with, or what the interests of the other side are, or what they are capable or not capable of. Because we should try to move forward with this, and we should try to engage other countries as well. I'm not talking just about America, all these 8 countries who did not ratify. There should be dialogues and discussions. They should be excited about this, and we don't see that.
Well, I think all of the governments are aware of what is at stake. Dialogue? I don't know. I imagine there's some concern because they are participants in the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference here. But whether their concern is preventing nuclear war or preventing nuclear weapons and the control they make possible from expanding to countries that do not currently have them.
We were given these brochures at the United Nations and we're discussing this. Like, they have a special program. In 2016, we're doing this. In 2018, we're doing this. And by 2020, let's say nobody else has nuclear weapons, everything, is going to be destroyed voluntarily. Is this even realistic? I think that's the main issue. Is this going to happen?
Well, there doesn't seem to be much enthusiasm for this on the part of the nuclear powers, who do say that stability and security are their main concern, and this is a result of the fact that they have nuclear weapons. They have attributed the security and stability of various regions of the world to the existence of nuclear weapons, whereas this is the balance of terror, which is not a viable basis on which humanity should be resting.
Do you think, Carla, as an expert and as a professional who has been to all these conferences and discussions and meetings at UN and out of it, do you think that UN has the power and the potential to be this great mediator in between these countries in order to make NPT a reality?
Well, the United Nations is veering in a direction that may be rendering it impotent in terms of being any kind of effective arbiter globally. It is subject to the interests of certain powerful members, and it is acting as an expression of the will of certain powerful members.